Okay, in this lesson, you're going to use right triangles and find side lengths and angles using SOHCAHTOA. So just remember that sine is opposite divided by hypotenuse. Cosine of an angle is the adjacent divided by hypotenuse. And tangent of an angle is the opposite divided by adjacent. So for this one, what I do is I write OAH. This is just to start out when you're first starting to do this. Then the angle that you're given, or look at the angle inside the triangle that's not the 90-degree angle. And it might be X, it might be a number. So you're going to look at this number and look at the side lengths that have X or a number. So if I'm trying to find X, X is opposite of the angle measure. And then 15 is the hypotenuse. So which trig function uses OH? Well, that's sine. So I'm going to use the sine ratio. So the sine of 32 degrees is equal to O divided by H. So the opposite is X, opposite, and the hypotenuse is 15. So to solve for X, what you do to get X by itself is multiply both sides by 15. So you can either write this as 15 sine of 32 equals X, or it's sine of 32, close the parentheses that come up on your calculator, times 15 equals X. So I don't have my scientific calculator right now, but it's going to be a decimal, so X is approximately equal to and rounds the nearest degree. Just be careful how you put this in your calculator. So I see people doing sine of 32 times 15 as one number. So the second one over here, again, I'm going to write OAH. This time I'm given a 41-degree angle, and I want to know X. So X is the hypotenuse, so I'm going to circle that. And I'm also given this side, which is the adjacent. So the trig function that uses the A and the H is cosine. So I write cosine of 41 degrees equals adjacent, which is 13 divided by hypotenuse, which is X. When you want to solve for X and it's in the denominator, you need to multiply both sides by X first. So now you have X times the cosine of 41 equals 13. So to solve for X, you divide both sides by the cosine of 41. So X is equal to 13 divided by the cosine of 41. And you can put this in your calculator, and it's going to be a decimal round to the nearest degree. Okay, the next one, I'm going to write OAH again. This time I have this angle, 62 degrees. So X, what I want to find, is opposite of 62 degrees. 14, what I'm given, is adjacent. So the trig ratio that uses O and A is tangent. So I do the tangent of 62 degrees equals opposite, which is X, divided by adjacent, which is 14. So to solve for X, you multiply both sides by 14. So it's either 14 tangent of 62 or tangent of 62, close the parentheses, times 14. So again, you're going to get a decimal. You're going to round to the nearest. Either if it says tenth, it's one decimal. If it says nearest distance, then it's the whole number. Okay, then the last one on this side. I write OAH. Look at your angle. You are given opposite. You want to know X. X is the hypotenuse. So if you have O and H, you're going to use the sine. So you write the sine of 28 degrees equals opposite, which is 12 divided by X, the hypotenuse. So to solve for X, you need to get X out of the denominator. So it's going to be X sine of 28 equals 12. And then divide both sides by the sine of 28. So x is approximately equal to whatever 12 divided by sine of 28 is as a decimal. So the last side, the previous page, we were finding distances. Now we're going to find angle measures. When you have to find an angle measure, you need to use the inverse button on your calculator. The inverse button looks like cosine inverse, sine inverse, tangent inverse, so find that on your calculator. So usually you have a cosine button, and then above in a different color it'll say cosine inverse or cosine -1. I didn't write that very well, but cosine inverse. So in order to get this button, you have to do second on your calculator, and I'll show it more in class. So I'm going to do OAH just like I did before, and I look at my angle and I'm given 12, which is the opposite, and I'm also given 15, which is the adjacent. So the trig function I'm going to use is tangent. So I do the tangent of the angle. Well, the angle is x. I want to know the angle equals 12 opposite over adjacent, which is 15. So now this is when you can't divide both sides by the tangent. Nope. You need to do the inverse button, which tells us what the angle is. So on your calculator, you do tangent, you do second tangent, so tangent inverse of 12/15. And you're going to get an angle number measure that you need to round the nearest degree, the nearest whole number. So you use the inverse button when you need to find an angle. So this example right here, I'm not trying to find an angle, so I know I'm not going to use the inverse button. I'm still going to write OAH. I'm going to look at my degree measure I'm given, and I want to know the hypotenuse, and I already know the adjacent. So I'm going to use cosine. So I do the cosine of the angle, which is 75 degrees, equals adjacent 12 over hypotenuse x. So to solve for x, you multiply both sides by x. So I have x cosine of 75 equals 12. And I divide both sides by the cosine of 75. So in your calculator, you put x equal, or 12 divided by cosine of 75. So x is approximately equal to, and then round, because it's going to be a number that goes on forever. Okay, next example. This time I'm trying to find the angle measure, so I know I'm going to use inverse. So I still write OAH. Talk about this angle x. I know the opposite. I know the hypotenuse. So I'm going to use the sine. So the sine of the angle x is equal to the opposite, 13, divided by the hypotenuse, which is 20. To figure out the angle, you need to use the inverse button. So you do second sine, or sine inverse, equals of 13 over 20. Put that in your calculator and round to the nearest degree. It's going to be a degree. Second one, or next one, I know I'm going to use the inverse button because I'm trying to find an angle measure. So I do OAH. I know the adjacent because it's touching the angle. Oops, I just circled opposite. And I know the hypotenuse. So I have AH. So that's going to be the cosine. So the cosine of x, the angle measure, is adjacent, which is 22, divided by hypotenuse, which is 37. So then I'm finding the angle measure, so I do cosine inverse of 22 over 37. And round that to the nearest degree in your calculator. And this one right here, I'm finding a side length, so I'm not going to use the inverse button. So I still write OAH. 31, so x is opposite, 18 is the hypotenuse. I'm going to use sine. So the sine of 31 equals x over 18. So I multiply both sides by 18 to solve for x. So x equals 18 sine of 31. And I put it in my calculator and round. It's a side length. I don't use sine inverse. And the next one, I'm trying to find the angle, so I'm going to use the inverse button. So I write OAH, and with x, I know the adjacent, I know the hypotenuse, so I'm going to use cosine. So it's the cosine of the angle measure x equals 12/16. So to find the angle measure, I do the cosine inverse of 12/16. Put it in my calculator and round the nearest degree. All the answers to these are also online underneath the key of the PDF document, so you can see what the final answers are since I don't have my calculator with me.